In the aftermath of this very unnecessary public spat around Greenland, I'd like to talk about what I feel it means for NATO and for the EU going forward. So I don't think we're going to see the end of NATO, but I do see this being reflective of a major change in how NATO operates. President Trump has repeatedly talked about his desire to leave NATO or question the value of NATO, which is actually an idea that doesn't have a lot of massive support in the US. Around 60 to 70% of Americans have historically supported and recently supported the idea of NATO, and also the US's continued membership of NATO. And this actually backs up the polling that shows that an overwhelming majority of Americans also don't support the current administration's desires at Greenland because they understand the rift that this is creating with other NATO members. With the midterms coming up in the US, it's also unlikely that Trump would do anything as deeply unpopular as leaving NATO. And in fact, we see some domestic policy discussions and decisions taking place in the US that actually show that Trump is concerned about losing support in the midterms. And obviously, if that happens, it then derails a lot of further efforts to implement policy for the remainder of his term. That said, this hasn't stopped Trump from claiming that NATO hasn't really done anything for the US and that they wouldn't help the US if they needed them. This despite the fact that the US is the only country that has actually ever triggered Article 5 in NATO and asked other member nations for help, and this was obviously in the wake of the 9/11 attacks on the US. And when corrected on this, he actually went further, kind of doubled down by saying that, well, the member nations that did assist the US with combat operations in Afghanistan actually stayed away from the front lines, which is obviously far from the truth. In any case, one has to understand obviously that only a small percentage of soldiers deployed to a war zone are ever actually going to see combat. The majority are going to be supporting those operations. So you're going to see logistics, transport, medical, administration, air operations, those sort of things. And that enables all of those people behind the scenes, enable the combat operations to take place. We've also seen Trump flip-flop on Ukraine, with him going so far as to actually blame Ukraine for the war and also repeat some very unnecessary Russian talking points in the negotiations. And then there have been the issue of the punitive tariffs that have been imposed on allied nations, which Trump has pushed forward with, regardless of the effect. And obviously those tariffs effectively are just a tax because they have a serious effect on the American taxpayer in terms of increasing costs, as well as obviously the country supplying the products. After Davos, we did see Trump claiming to have reached a deal after discussions with Mark Rutte, the head of NATO. But it's important to note that neither Greenland nor Denmark have any knowledge of this deal at all. And any deal that affects Greenland obviously would have to have approval from both the Danish and the Greenlandic governments. What's more likely is that at this meeting with NATO, Trump was made aware of the rights that the US already have in Greenland, which actually gives him, in terms of things like the Golden Dome, increasing military presence. He actually gives him what he needs anyway. I think his team also would have probably gone to great lengths to explain to him what sort of retaliatory measures Europe could potentially have enacted on the US. And this, together with the lack of popularity for the issue domestically, probably meant that he had to dial it back quite a bit. I think the reason also why we didn't see Europe stepping up aggressively to match Trump's rhetoric is for two reasons. Firstly, the EU has never really conducted itself in that way. And secondly, because they saw this as being political pressure rather than a legal or a security type of dispute. And also, by responding aggressively to Trump, this would have further validated his coercive tactic and given them legitimacy rather than downplaying them and dealing with the issue politically. I'm not saying all of this to bash President Trump. He's got his reasons for acting the way that he does and the decisions that he makes. It's simply to highlight why Europe will see the US as an increasingly unreliable ally. I also want to take a step back from all of this just to kind of briefly touch on what NATO really means for the Western world at large. If we take a look at Europe prior to the formation of NATO in 1949, and sort of going back here like the Second World War and then the First World War and then back into the 19th century. It was a continent that was in constant conflict. And in, as late as the 20th century, between World War I and World War II, we saw between 80 and 100 million deaths, which is just staggering. I mean, some days in the First World War, we saw deaths, in particular battles, in the number of tens of thousands of people lost. So since then, the deadliest war has obviously been the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we've seen over 1 million deaths in that one, and obviously tens of millions of people being displaced. So it's not unreasonable to make the statement that the formation of NATO and obviously the EU has been a net positive for the people of Europe and for peace in general. Now, going forward, the EU and the rest of NATO know that they cannot realistically count on the US as a reliable ally. Canada and the European members of NATO obviously need to plan for the future, and they need to plan for a future where the US will only act on issues of its choosing and not necessarily matters that prior agreements compel it to. And when I say this point, I mean it. I'm saying it explicitly because if we look at the 1917 Lansing Declaration, the US was very clear in their recognition of Danish sovereignty over Greenland. So this is an agreement that the US had put forward, and yet we see now the current president has been trying to bully an allied country to hand it over to the US. So we've seen that policy may be reversed between administrations, and we've seen already that pressure may be applied by the US on historical allies via economic means or even threats of annexation. And some people might dismiss these threats and say that they are kind of jokes, or maybe not be taken seriously, but Canada has actually taken it seriously enough that they have recently wargamed scenarios where the US invades Canada. Now, this obviously isn't anti-American sentiment at all. It's just sensible planning and risk management by the Canadian authorities. Now, one of the areas where successive US administrations, and especially President Trump most recently, have criticized NATO is on its lack of serious attention to Arctic security, and also in general the other NATO members spending on defense, which has often lagged behind the NATO target of at least 2% of GDP. So in the wake of the Greenland issue, what I think we are going to see is a more cohesive and scaled up long-term NATO security presence in the region. I'm talking about the Arctic, Greenland. And not only will this obviously provide security in the region, but it will also reduce Trump's ability to exert pressure on the EU for additional control in the region. So what does NATO look like going forward? Well, I think what we're going to see is the European nations will continue to increase their defense spending and obviously the cooperation. Poland is taking the lead in Europe with around 4.7% of the GDP being spent on defense. And, historically, if we look back at Poland, in 1939, we saw them being invaded by both Russia and Germany within days of each other. So Poland obviously has learned from their mistakes historically of being perceived as being a weak European nation, and they don't want to repeat that. Denmark is aiming for 3% in 2026. The Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are all increasing their defense spending significantly, with the three each aiming for around 5% of GDP spend on defense. Germany sits at around 2.5%. We might say that, look at that and say, well, it might be lower than other EU nations, but considering the size of the German economy, this actually represents a very large amount in real defense spending. The UK is around 2.4%, France around 2%, but this doesn't really also tell the whole tale, because where the US has scaled back its support for Ukraine, the EU nations have stepped in and are providing almost everything that Ukraine needs to continue its fight against Russia. So as an example of this, France now provides Ukraine with the majority of its intelligence, and this is somewhere around 2/3, maybe between 2/3 and 3/4 of its intelligence. And this was, up until very recently, one area where the Ukraine was heavily reliant on the US, and this was also one of the points that President Trump could use to kind of push back or negotiate with Zelensky on. Then, for NATO itself, we've actually seen the size of NATO increase substantially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, with both Finland and Sweden becoming members. And what is interesting is that prior to 2022, the citizens of both countries had actually shown very little interest in being NATO members. And a lot of the concern centered around it potentially worsening relations with Russia. But after witnessing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the sentiment changed, and the realization was that the only long-term security guarantee that either of these countries had was in a collective defensive pact. And obviously this is NATO. In addition to new member countries, all NATO members in the EU in particular have increased their own defense spending significantly. So it's safe to say that Russia's invasion of Ukraine only further proved the use case for NATO. The fact that European spending is on defense now is, the fact that Europe is now spending more on defense now and is providing almost everything that Ukraine needs shows that even if it's long overdue, Europe is stepping up to take its own security more seriously, which, if anything, means NATO will emerge stronger.